The storm had buried Aurora beneath the waves months ago, yet the ocean refused to keep its secrets. When a retired Navy SEAL and his loyal German shepherd uncovered the wreck on the Oregon coast, they didn't just find twisted metal. They found a message carved in steel. Use this to build something that helps the lost ones. From that moment, nothing in Jack Morgan's quiet life would ever be the same. Reporters called it a miracle. The FBI called it classified. But Jack called it a second chance. Because inside that wreck lay the truth about a man who tried to build perfection and paid the price for it. And as Jack rebuilt the ship into a sanctuary for the broken, he discovered that some ghosts don't haunt to harm, they come back to guide. So before you dive into this story, ask yourself, if the ocean whispered your name tonight, would you answer it? Comment where you're listening from, or just say amen for everyone searching for their way home. The storm had finally passed. 3 long days of roaring wind and sideways rain had left Tillamook Bay draped in silence, a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The Pacific was no longer raging, but breathing in long, heavy sighs that broke against the gray sand. The early light filtered weakly through the mist, painting everything in shades of pewter. Jack Morgan walked along the beach with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who'd learned to move carefully through life. He was in his mid-40s, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of build that once belonged to a Navy SEAL and still carried the memory of discipline. His dark hair was streaked with silver around the temples, his face angular and marked by faint scars that caught the mist like pale threads. A short, graying beard framed a jaw that had clenched its way through too many storms, both real and remembered. He wore a weather-beaten brown field jacket, its elbows patched, its zipper stubborn. Beneath it, a flannel shirt faded from red to rust. His jeans were tucked into waterproof boots that left deep prints behind him. Jack's eyes, steel blue, steady and watchful, scanned the beach automatically, the old military instinct never fully fading. A few yards ahead trotted Ranger, his German shepherd. The dog was 5 years old, big-boned and strong, his coat a swirl of charcoal and pale gray that gleamed almost silver when the fog shifted. Ranger's tail swayed low and calm, his ears pricked forward. He moved with the smooth, powerful grace of a creature bred for service, the kind that could leap, track, or guard on command, but whose loyalty was no longer a duty, only devotion. Jack had adopted him after both of them left the Navy. Ranger had been a K-9 in Jack's last unit, trained to detect explosives. They'd survived the same ambush in Kandahar, the one that ended Jack's career and left him with a jagged scar across his ribs and a deeper one inside his head. Since then, the two had been inseparable. The fog thickened as they approached the tide line. Pieces of kelp and driftwood littered the sand. The air smelled of salt, pine, and something metallic, the scent of the world freshly rinsed by chaos. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, his voice low, rough from years of shouting over helicopter rotors. Ranger stopped. Every muscle in his body locked, the fur along his spine bristling. He wasn't looking at Jack. He was staring into the dense, white curtain of fog that clung to the horizon like smoke. A deep, guttural growl rolled from his chest. Jack froze. He knew that sound. It wasn't the casual, alert bark of a dog seeing a seagull. It was the warning tone, territorial, primal. The same sound Ranger used when they were clearing buildings in hostile territory. "What is it?" Jack asked quietly, stepping closer. The fog ahead rippled, as if something enormous moved behind it. Jack's pulse quickened. He reached down, resting his gloved hand on Ranger's neck. The dog's muscles trembled under his palm, rigid as steel cable. And then, Through the shifting white veil, a silhouette began to emerge. At first it looked like the hull of a fishing boat, but the shape was wrong. Too flat on top, too angular. The fog peeled back in thin ribbons, revealing something that looked like a ship cobbled together from scavenged parts, a monstrous fusion of trailer, container, and barge. The thing had no color, only the dull sheen of wet metal. One side was crumpled as if crushed by a giant's hand. Cables hung loose, snapping in the wind. "What the hell?" Jack whispered. Ranger barked once, sharp, commanding, and looked back at him as if to say, "Do something." Jack stepped forward, his boots sinking into the wet sand. He could feel the cold tide pushing against his ankles. The massive structure loomed ahead, half submerged in the shallows. The surf hissed around it, retreating like the breath of a dying animal. Up close, the wreck was even stranger. Welded metal panels met at crooked angles. Rust bled from every seam. There were remnants of solar panels on the roof, cracked and useless, and a small wind turbine bent backward like a broken arm. Jack reached out and placed a hand against the hull. It was cold, colder than the water. Beneath his palm, he felt a faint vibration, a low, groaning hum that wasn't mechanical but almost alive. The sound brought a shiver down his spine. For a brief second, it reminded him of the deep-sea submersible hums he used to hear during reconnaissance dives, except this time, the vibration was faint, irregular, dying. Ranger circled the wreck, nose to the air, sniffing for movement. He barked again, once toward the small opening near the midsection where the metal had split. Jack leaned closer. Letters, half erased by salt, were etched near the bow. He wiped the grime with his glove. Aurora. The name gleamed faintly through the corrosion. It wasn't on any registry he'd ever heard of, and Jack Morgan had seen plenty of classified vessels in his day. He stepped back, running his hand through his damp hair. "No way this washed up from any fleet I know," he muttered. The wind carried his voice nowhere. Ranger whined softly and nudged his leg. Jack crouched, meeting the dog's eyes. "Yeah, I know. Feels wrong." From the corner of his vision, he saw movement, two distant figures walking toward him along the beach. Locals, maybe. One was a fisherman Jack recognized. Tommy Holt, mid-50s, weathered face, beard salt and pepper, wearing a bright orange rain jacket patched at the elbows. He was the kind of man who greeted everyone with the same weary nod, a lifetime of sea behind his eyes. The other was his teenage nephew, thin, pale, hood pulled tight. Tommy raised a hand. "Morning, Jack. You seeing what I'm seeing?" Jack straightened. "Depends. You seeing a ship that doesn't belong to any sane man?" Tommy squinted through the fog, then whistled. "That's no crab boat. Lord, looks like someone welded a trailer park together and threw it in the ocean." Jack gave a humorless half-smile. "You call the Coast Guard yet?" "On it," Tommy said, pulling out his radio. Jack nodded, grateful. He crouched again beside Ranger, who was still staring at the wreck, uneasy. The dog's tail was stiff, his ears pinned forward. Jack's fingers brushed the cold hull once more. The vibration had stopped. Whatever faint life had been inside this beast was gone. He stepped back, exhaling slowly, his breath clouding the air. "Come on, boy," he said quietly. "Let's give them room to do their job." As he turned, his gaze lingered on the word Aurora. The letters seemed almost to glow in the mist, as though the ship had one last thing to say before silence took it forever. Jack didn't know then that this wreck would reopen every wound he'd spent years burying, or that it carried not just the echo of a storm, but the ghost of a man who once believed he could outsmart the ocean. Behind him, Ranger gave a low growl, not of fear, but warning. The tide was coming in, and with it, the past. The sirens came low and distant, rolling through the fog like thunder across the sand. By the time Captain Roy Bennett's convoy reached the shoreline, the wreck of Aurora looked like a stranded whale, black and silent against the gray surf. Captain Bennett stepped out first. He was a man in his early 50s, tall, but starting to stoop from decades of salt wind and responsibility. His hair, once jet black, had faded to steel gray at the edges, cropped short in the way Navy men never seemed to unlearn. His face bore deep grooves carved by years at sea, not from smiling, but from squinting against storms. A clean, square jaw framed his mouth, though a trace of stubble hinted at how quickly he'd been called out. He'd once been Jack Morgan's commanding officer during a classified SEAL deployment. Back then, Roy had been the man who always knew what to do. But years of command, loss, and the slow erosion of faith in the system he'd served had made him quieter now, methodical, but haunted. "Jesus, Jack," Roy muttered as he surveyed the monstrous shape of Aurora. "You sure know how to find trouble even in retirement." Jack gave a wry smile, pulling his jacket tighter. "It found me, Roy. I was just walking my dog." Roy's gaze shifted to Ranger, who sat obediently by Jack's leg, silver-gray coat damp with mist. The dog's sharp amber eyes tracked the movement of every uniform on the beach. "Still got him, huh? Good boy," Roy said softly, bending just enough to offer a gloved pat. Ranger's ears flicked back, acknowledging the gesture, but keeping his gaze locked on the wreck. Behind Roy, 2 Coast Guard technicians unloaded gear from the truck: oxygen tanks, waterproof cameras, and hazard markers. A young female officer with a serious expression moved briskly toward Roy. "Perimeter's set, Captain," she said. Her name tag read M. Carter. She couldn't have been more than 30, her red hair tucked neatly under her cap, freckles scattered across a determined face. "No radiation, no fuel leaks. Structure looks stable for now, but the tide's turning in 2 hours." "Understood," Roy said. "Let's make this fast." He turned to Jack. "You might as well stay put, but I'm going to need a statement later." Jack nodded. "I figured." Roy motioned to 2 divers who were already wading toward the broken hull. They carried long aluminum poles with cameras mounted on the ends. The wreck looked like it had been forged by madness, welded seams at impossible angles, remnants of solar panels glinting faintly under the fog-diffused light. The sound of metal on metal echoed as one of the divers pried open a side panel. A hollow clang followed by the slosh of trapped seawater spilling out. Then Ranger barked. Once. Sharp. Jack stiffened. That bark wasn't random. It was alert. Discovery. Roy turned sharply. "What's he got?" Ranger darted forward, splashing into the shallows, near the rear of the wreck. Nose low, tail stiff. Jack followed, his boots sinking in the wet sand. The dog stopped by a twisted hatch, whining as he scratched the corroded metal. "There," Jack said, pointing. "He's found something." Roy waved to his team. "Bring the cutting torch." Within minutes, sparks hissed against the damp air. When the hatch finally gave way, it opened to a narrow compartment filled with debris, broken wiring, a rusted toolbox, and the unmistakable smell of diesel and rot. Amid the mess, something metallic gleamed faintly. Roy reached in with a gloved hand and pulled it free. A sealed metal case, rectangular and heavy, covered in barnacles and corrosion. A faded engraving on the side read, "Property of Aurora Systems, Inc." Jack frowned. "Never heard of it." "Neither have I," Roy muttered. He set the box down carefully. The clasp was fused shut with salt. "Get the pry bar." When it finally cracked open, everyone fell silent. Inside, nestled in foam padding, were two things: a black encrypted hard drive, military grade, a thin steel plate, perfectly preserved, etched with a line of text. Roy brushed it clean. The words shone through. "If you find this, the system has failed." Beneath it, a name. Marcus Hale. Roy looked up at Jack. "You recognize that name?" Jack shook his head slowly. "No, should I?" "Maybe," Roy said, his tone unreadable. "He was a prodigy. Hale was the guy behind Project Hydra, government AI infrastructure testing. Went off the grid 5 years ago after a fire killed his wife and daughter in Santa Rosa. They said he lost his mind." The young officer, Carter, exhaled softly. "So, this could be his?" Roy nodded. "Looks like it." They stared at the strange box as though it might breathe. Before Roy could speak again, headlights cut through the mist. A black SUV rolled down the access road and stopped behind the Coast Guard trucks. From it stepped Claire Donovan, her badge flashing briefly in the gray light. She was in her late 30s, with shoulder-length dark brown hair tucked behind one ear, strands already wet from the drizzle. Her face was striking, not soft, but defined by sharp lines and eyes the color of winter rain. She wore a black tactical jacket over a navy shirt, jeans tucked into combat boots, a sidearm holstered at her hip. Claire moved with quiet confidence, the kind of poise that came from years of seeing things that couldn't be unseen. She'd been an FBI special agent for over a decade, specializing in cybercrimes and classified disappearances. The rumors said she'd lost a fiancé, also an agent, during an investigation gone wrong, a wound that never fully healed. "Captain Bennett," she greeted curtly. "Special Agent Donovan, FBI. We got a call from command about your find." Roy folded his arms. That was fast. "Classified name, unknown vessel, encrypted drive?" "It pings a dozen red flags," Claire said. Her gaze shifted to Jack, assessing him. "You're the one who found it?" "Just walking my dog," Jack replied evenly. Claire's brow arched. "You a civilian?" "Retired military," Roy interjected. "Jack Morgan, former SEAL." Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition or suspicion. "I've read that name somewhere. Probably in a report that's still redacted," Jack said dryly. She didn't smile. Instead, she crouched by the opened box, slipping on nitrile gloves. She lifted the steel plate, tracing the inscription with her thumb. "Marcus Hale," she murmured. "That name hasn't surfaced in years." "Looks like he resurfaced all right," Roy said. "Or at least his ghost did." Claire stood, glancing toward the wreck half buried in the surf. "Seal this area. No one touches the drive until it's logged and cleared. I'll take it to our Portland field lab." Jack folded his arms. "And if it's something bigger? Something you weren't supposed to find?" Her gaze locked on his, unflinching. "Then it's my job to figure out who wanted it buried." Roy looked between them, the weight of command settling back onto his shoulders. The fog was rolling in thicker now, swallowing the wreck inch by inch. Claire turned to leave but paused, eyes narrowing at the word Aurora faintly visible on the hull. Aurora. she repeated quietly. Light born from darkness. How poetic. Jack watched the fog close around the ship again, his voice low. Or maybe it's just what's left after everything burns. The waves hissed, washing over the metal case's empty imprint in the sand, as if erasing what little truth had been found that morning. The FBI field office in Portland sat like a concrete fortress at the edge of the city, a building made of angles and shadows, humming with quiet purpose. Inside, the smell of old coffee and printer toner lingered in the stale air. Jack Morgan sat across from Claire Donovan in a narrow, windowless lab that looked more like a bunker than a workplace. The encrypted hard drive from the wreck lay on the table between them, still damp around the edges, sealed inside a forensic container. Beside it, a young technician named Eli Park hunched over a console, typing furiously. Eli was barely 30, wiry and pale, his black hair sticking up like he'd been electrocuted one too many times by his own experiments. Thick glasses magnified his brown eyes, and his clothes, an ill-fitting hoodie and faded jeans, gave him the air of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Despite his disheveled appearance, his mind worked like a precision instrument. He spoke without looking up. Encryption's brutal, but it's not military, it's proprietary. Whoever built this didn't want the government to find it, but they wanted it to last forever. Claire stood with her arms folded, weight on one hip, eyes trained on the monitor. She looked more restless than usual. Can you open it? Eli grinned faintly. Can I open it? You wound me, Agent Donovan. Jack, leaning against the wall, muttered dryly, just make sure it doesn't explode. Relax, old man, Eli said. It's data, not dynamite. Ranger lay quietly by Jack's feet, his gray and silver coat blending with the polished floor. The dog's ears flicked occasionally, reacting to the hum of the machines and the low tones of voices. He was patient, but watchful, the same way he had been in Afghanistan, waiting for danger that no one else sensed yet. Eli hit a key. The screens flickered, and rows of folders appeared, labeled in clinical precision. Blueprints, system logs, video archives. Claire exhaled softly. We're in. Eli grinned. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Aurora. Jack stepped closer, his reflection appearing in the screen's dim glow. Claire opened the folder titled Video Archives. There were dozens of clips, each labeled with timestamps. She clicked the first one. The video opened with a flicker of static before resolving into the image of a man standing in a cavernous workshop. He was tall and lean, mid-40s, dressed in a gray jumpsuit dusted with metal shavings. His hair was unkempt, a light brown streaked with early gray, his face drawn but handsome in a haunted way. His blue eyes burned with intensity, the kind that bordered on mania. My name is Marcus Hale, the man said into the camera, his voice steady but cold. If you are watching this, then my dream either succeeded or destroyed me. Jack and Claire exchanged a look. On the screen, Hale gestured behind him, to the skeletal frame of a vessel, the beginnings of Aurora. Welded steel ribs rose from the floor like the bones of a leviathan. The world has become dependent, Hale continued. Governments serve corporations. Innovation feeds greed, not survival. So I built this, Aurora. A self-sustaining vessel, power from sun and wind, food from hydroponics, water from the sea itself, a society of one. The next clip showed progress. The hull complete, solar panels gleaming like scales, Hale's face more gaunt now, his eyes darker, his smile gone. He spoke again, the audio crackling. They tried to stop me. Hydranet Defense said I breached contract. But I didn't steal their data. I liberated it. They wanted weaponized autonomy. I wanted freedom. Claire paused the video. Hydranet, she repeated quietly. That's the same defense contractor your unit worked for, isn't it? Jack's jaw tightened. 15 years ago, they were testing unmanned transport systems. My team guarded the prototypes. Then a convoy went dark in the Mojave. No survivors. The official report blamed sandstorms. But you never believed that. He looked at her. Would you? Claire didn't answer. She clicked to the next file. Hale appeared again. Thinner now. Beard overgrown. Eyes bloodshot. The workshop was gone, replaced by the interior of Aurora, dimly lit by screens. Outside the porthole, endless ocean. Day 182, he said. The system works. Power stable. No human contact in 6 months. I have built what no government could. A new order. He laughed suddenly, a brittle, hollow sound. I am free. I am. He stopped. A tremor ran through the video feed. There's a storm. The next file was chaos. The image shook violently, alarms blaring. Rain and seawater streaked across the camera lens. Hale's voice rose over the roar of wind. The system lied! The data lied! He slammed a fist against the console, his face illuminated by red emergency lights. The models were perfect, but the sea doesn't care about models. It doesn't. The feed cut to black. For a long moment, no one spoke. Eli finally broke the silence. I think we just watched a man lose his mind. Jack's voice was quiet, almost reverent. No. We watched a man realize he wasn't God. Claire looked at the dark screen, her reflection faint against it. Hydranet Defense, she murmured again. If he stole something from them, well, they might have had reason to make him disappear. Eli frowned. Or maybe he disappeared himself. People like Hale. They burn too bright, too fast. Jack rubbed the scar along his ribs, the old wound throbbing like memory. That fire that killed his family. You think it was an accident? Claire's expression hardened. Hydranet's report says yes, but reports can be rewritten. She turned back to the drive. We'll need to cross-check this with classified archives. I'll call DC. Jack's eyes stayed on the last frozen frame. Marcus Hale, mid-yell, his hand raised as though still trying to control the storm. Look at him, Jack said. He didn't just build a ship. He built a rebellion. Claire met his gaze. And now we have to find out what he was rebelling against. The hum of the servers filled the silence. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, a steady rhythm that sounded almost like the sea. Ranger lifted his head and let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the flickering screen. Jack knelt beside him, resting a steadying hand on his fur. Easy, boy. It's just ghosts. But deep down, he knew better. Some ghosts didn't haunt you from the past. They called you forward. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Rain fell in thin, silvery threads across the windshield as Jack Morgan guided his old Chevy pickup through the winding coastal road toward Tillamook. The headlights cut pale tunnels through the mist, and the rhythmic wipers drummed a hollow beat that matched the pulse in his temples. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, his gray and silver fur glistening from the damp. His amber eyes never left his owner's face, as though sensing that the storm outside wasn't the one to worry about. When Jack reached his cabin, a lonely structure perched between the pines and the sea, the world was already sinking into dusk. He parked, stepped out, and inhaled the cold, briny air. For years, this place had been his refuge. Tonight, it felt more like a cell. He shrugged off his jacket and hung it by the door, the sound of the wind whispering through cracks in the wood. Ranger padded across the floor, circling once before settling near the fireplace. Jack poured himself a cup of black coffee, though his hands trembled slightly as he lifted it. On the desk by the window, his laptop waited. The forensic copy of the Aurora hard drive lay beside it, still sealed. He hesitated, staring at the screen's reflection, a face lined and hollowed by years of silence and survival. Then, as if pulled by something inevitable, he powered it on. The recovered video file loaded instantly. Title: Log Zerus Final. Static. Then the storm. Marcus Hale's voice tore through the speakers, raw and panicked. "The system lied. The data lied." Jack's breath caught. The screen shook violently as the Aurora pitched in the waves. Sparks rained from the ceiling. Red alarms flashed across the walls. Hale stumbled into view, soaked, wild-eyed, slamming his fist against the dead console. Metal screamed. Waves pounded. Hale turned toward the camera. Blood streaked across his face, eyes wide with a kind of divine madness. "I built perfection," he shouted. "But perfection doesn't float." The hull groaned like a dying beast. The last thing visible before the image fractured into chaos was Hale gripping a steel rod, carving something into the wall behind him. Deliberate. Desperate. Then the wave hit. The screen went black. For a moment, Jack didn't breathe. The only sound was the rising hiss of the wind outside and his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. Then the memory came. Not of the video, but of the desert. Sandstorms, the gunfire, the explosion that killed half his unit. He could smell the burnt oil, hear the screams in the static. His chest locked. The walls of the cabin began to shrink around him. He tried to stand but stumbled, the mug of coffee shattering on the floor. His vision tunneled. Ranger barked sharply, the sound echoing in the wooden room. Jack's breath came in short, ragged bursts. "No! No!" His hands trembled violently. The world tilted. Ranger moved before instinct had time to think. The German shepherd leaped up, heavy paws on Jack's knees, pressing his weight against the man's chest. The dog's warm breath and the rhythmic beat of his heart cut through the panic like a signal flare. Jack felt the fur beneath his fingers, coarse and real. The heat of life pushed back against the cold flood of memory. Slowly, his lungs opened again. Air came in shaky gasps. He leaned forward, burying his face into Ranger's ruff. "Good boy," he whispered hoarsely. "Good boy." Minutes passed before his body stopped trembling. Outside, the storm eased, replaced by the steady drip of rain through the gutters. Jack stood, still unsteady, and stared at the laptop. The last frame of Hale's video glowed faintly, the man's hand against the wall, carving something no one else had noticed. Jack rewound, frame by frame. There, a flash of reflected metal, the faint outline of letters being etched into the wall before the wave consumed him. He squinted. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Something inside him, that same cold, mission-trained instinct, clicked into place. The next morning, Jack drove back to Osprey Point. The sky was the color of gunmetal, the sea calm but watchful. The aurora lay on its side like a sleeping giant, surrounded by yellow tape and salt air. Claire Donovan was already there, her black SUV parked by the dunes. She looked tired but composed, her brown hair pulled into a loose knot, sunglasses hiding the exhaustion in her eyes. "Couldn't stay away either?" she asked. Jack stepped out, pulling his collar up against the wind. "You ever get the feeling a dead man's trying to tell you something?" She studied him for a beat. "Only every other week." He told her about the final video, about hail carving into the hull right before the end. Her skepticism faltered just enough to let curiosity in. "Show me," she said. Together they climbed back into the wreck. The air inside was thick with the scent of salt and rust. The light from their flashlights danced across warped steel. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, echoing through the hollow interior. Ranger followed close behind, nose twitching, paws silent on the slick metal. Jack led the way to the aft section, the same compartment where they had found the sealed case. He swept the beam of his light across the bulkhead. The walls shimmered with condensation. "There," he said softly. On a warped section of steel, half hidden beneath grime, were shallow grooves, letters carved by hand. Jack knelt, brushing away the rust with his glove. The words came into focus, clean and sharp even after months underwater. "Use this to build something that helps the lost ones." Claire crouched beside him, tracing the letters with her gloved fingers. "It's his will," she said quietly. "A final message." Jack nodded. He knew he was going down. He didn't want the dream to die with him. They stood in silence for a long time. The wind moaned through the fractured hull, sounding almost like a sea. Ranger let out a low whine, pressing against Jack's leg. The man reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "We found it, boy," he murmured. "We found what he left." Claire straightened, her face unreadable. "You realize what this means?" "Yeah," Jack said. "That this wasn't just one man's obsession. It was a mission." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "And you've never been good at walking away from those, have you?" Jack looked out through the jagged hole in the hull toward the sea. Vast, gray, endless. "No," he said quietly. "Not the right ones." The surf rolled in and out, washing through the wreck like time itself, erasing footprints, but not intentions. Somewhere out there, Marcus Hale had died believing his work was lost. But as Jack stood in the hollow shell of Aurora, he understood something else entirely. The man hadn't built a ship. He'd built a message, and now it had found its reader. The story spread faster than the tides. Within a week, the image of the Aurora, once a ghost ship half buried in Oregon's gray surf, was plastered across every major network in the country. Morning anchors spoke of the genius's final message, while talking heads debated Marcus Hale's sanity and whether his final words, carved into steel, were a manifesto or a confession. The wreck became a pilgrimage site for conspiracy theorists, dreamers, and those hungry for a story that felt larger than themselves. But Jack Morgan wanted none of it. He had seen how fame corroded truth, how noise swallowed meaning. While drones buzzed over the coastline and reporters camped by the marina, Jack disappeared back into the fog, refusing every interview, every book deal, every camera. He spent his days where it all began, on that cold strip of beach, rebuilding in silence. It was Captain Roy Bennett who found him there one morning, knee-deep in sawdust and welding sparks beside the dismantled hull of Aurora. Roy looked older than he had weeks ago, his gray hair pushed flat by the ocean breeze, his weathered hands tucked into his jacket. "You planning to live out here now?" Roy asked, voice half gruff, half amused. Jack looked up from his work. Sweat streaked through the dust on his face. His flannel sleeves rolled up, the tendons in his forearms taut from lifting sheets of metal. "Not live," he said, setting down the torch. "Build." Roy's gaze drifted over the structure. The once tilted hull was now upright, supported by wooden braces, surrounded by stacks of reclaimed lumber and steel beams. The name Aurora was still faintly visible, though the letters had been cleaned and repainted in a deep, hopeful blue. "You really think this will work?" Roy asked. Jack smiled faintly, a rare, unguarded expression. "It already has." The sound of footsteps approached from behind, light, deliberate. Claire Donovan, in a dark denim jacket and gray sweater, stepped into view. Her hair was loose for once, tousled by the wind. She looked different out here, less agent, more human. "The press finally gave up," she said. "They're calling it old news now. Guess the next scandal showed up on time." "Good," Jack replied. "We don't need them here." Claire crossed her arms, watching him work. "You sure about this, Morgan? Turning the wreck of a dead man's dream into a workshop for lost kids? You're aware that's the kind of thing people write songs about." "Then let them write, Justin." Jack boomed. "As long as the kids show up." They did. Slowly, one by one. The first was Leo Hansen, a lanky 15-year-old with oil-stained hands and cautious brown eyes. His father, a fisherman, had died at sea 2 winters earlier, leaving Leo adrift with no plan and no patience for sympathy. He showed up one morning, shoulders squared, pretending he'd been just passing by. Jack handed him a wrench, without a word, and Leo never stopped coming back. The second was Maya Caldwell, 22, dark-skinned, small-framed, her hair cropped close on one side and long on the other. She was an ex-engineering student from Portland who had dropped out after losing a scholarship. She moved and spoke fast, her mind sharper than most of the tools in Jack's shed. When she first saw the half-restored Aurora, she laughed. "You're rebuilding a metaphor," she said. "That's either genius or madness." Jack just handed her a welding mask. And then there were others, local kids, a few veterans, men and women who had once belonged to the system, but somehow slipped through its cracks. The Aurora Workshop, as Claire called it, began as a joke but quickly turned into something real. Weeks bled into months. The clang of hammers replaced the crash of waves. The smell of sawdust and burnt steel filled the air, where salt and rust once reigned. Jack taught them everything he knew. Not about war, but about patience, about building things that could outlast failure. Ranger became their mascot, padding slowly from one workstation to another. His silver-gray fur had grown lighter around the muzzle, and his gait had a dignified heaviness, the weight of years. The younger apprentices adored him. Leo even built a small wooden bed for the dog beside the open bay doors. Roy handled logistics, calling in favors from old Navy contacts to supply tools and safety gear. Claire, who told herself she was just observing, somehow ended up managing the workshop's funding applications and outreach. When the local paper wanted to do a follow-up story, she convinced them to frame it not as a memorial to Marcus Hale, but as a tribute to resilience. By spring, the Aurora was no longer a wreck. It was the heart of a living thing. The hull had been converted into a training space, the steel walls repainted white, The words Hale had carved preserved in glass above the entrance. On the day of the grand opening, the sun broke through the Oregon clouds for the first time in weeks. The small crowd gathered near the dock. Townspeople, veterans, a few reporters kept at a polite distance. Jack stood beside Claire and Roy, dressed in a clean shirt and his old leather jacket. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, but proud nonetheless. Roy gave a short speech, direct, simple, the way a seaman tells a truth. Claire spoke next, her tone softer, her words deliberate. Marcus Hale built Aurora to escape, she said. Jack Morgan rebuilt it to bring people home. When it was Jack's turn, he stepped forward, cleared his throat, and said only, "This place isn't about me. It's about learning how to stay standing, even when everything else sinks." The applause came quietly, sincere and brief. As the crowd dispersed, Claire lingered beside him, looking up at the Aurora's curved hull, now gleaming under the golden light. "He built a fortress to escape," she said softly. "You turned it into a home." Jack smiled, the corner of his mouth lifting. Maybe that's what soldiers do best. Rebuild from wrecks. Ranger stretched out nearby, eyes half closed, soaking in the sunlight. Around him, laughter from the workshop echoed like waves on a calm shore. Leo was showing Maya how to use a power sander, and she was teasing him about his crooked technique. Roy stood by the dock, talking to a fisherman about securing more timber. The sea shimmered like liquid glass, gentle and forgiving. For the first time in years, Jack Morgan felt something close to peace. The ghosts of war, of failure, of the Aurora's storm had quieted. Not gone, but quieter, like the hum of a distant engine. He looked toward the horizon where the sun bled into the ocean. Somewhere beyond that line, Marcus Hale's bones lay beneath the waves, but his words had found life again. A breeze rustled through the open doors of the workshop, carrying the faint metallic scent of solder and salt. Jack turned to call for Ranger, but the dog was gone. Only paw prints trailed across the sand toward the shoreline. He followed slowly, his eyes narrowing in the fading light, as a silhouette, tall, thin, almost human, seemed to move along the distant edge of the surf. The sea breeze whispered through the wreckage, sounding eerily like a voice. Jack blinked, and the shape vanished. The tide rolled in, erasing Ranger's prints one by one. And for a long time Jack stood there, listening to the ocean breathe, unsure whether what he'd seen was a trick of the light or the ghost of a man who'd finally come home.